Hello, everyone. My name is Lisa Allen, pronoun she, her, and I am one of the co-directors of the Notebooks Collective. We are a virtual literary art space focused on community, connection, and continued learning. We have future events listed on our website. The Notebooks Collective believes that Black Lives Matter and acknowledges that as a virtual organization, our offices are on the unceded lands of the Kickapoo, Massachusetts, and Pawtucket tribes. Native peoples across the world continue to preserve and celebrate their cultures, and we encourage you to support Native writers and artists. Since our events are attended by people all over the US, we encourage you to use this map that Becca will drop into the chat to see what Native land you live on. We know that these are stressful times, and we are glad that you have joined us tonight to celebrate community. I now want to welcome Becca, who will introduce our speakers.
I am muted. Thanks, Lisa. I'm happy to be here. Writers are introverts by nature, happy to shut themselves up in the woods, like Kathy did this past week, to dive deep into our words and our muse. I too find it hard sometimes to break out of that shell of quiet, especially when the world is so loud. But poems are not born in solitude, nor are our books completed in isolation. Our writing is often in conversation with other poems from the past and the present, or we are working from comments and insights our fellow writers provide in workshop, or our work benefits by the time we take to recharge when we are discussing poems we love with friends we love. Tonight's event exemplifies this introvert-extrovert communion. Our speakers tonight are poets, our editors, are part of a writers group in Salem, Massachusetts. Kathy and Jennifer have spent their time locked up with their work and also time with each other, revising, workshopping, reviewing, reading. They know each other's work intimately, and while the words are their own, they were supported and propelled by others. Writing is writing. Writing is also revising, reading, talking, mentoring, editing, sharing, and supporting. I'm so happy to be able to sit back and listen to these two read poems and bring us aspects of their writing community. And so without further ado, let me introduce our speakers tonight. Kathleen Aguero, she, hers, latest book of poetry is World Happiness Index from Tiger Bark Press. She has published several other collections of poetry. After that, Daughter of, The Real Weather, Thirsty Day, and Investigations, The Mystery of the Girl Sleuth. She is co-editor of 3 collections of multicultural literature, A Gift of Tongues, An Ear to the Ground, and Daily Fare. Recipient of a Massachusetts Fellowship in Poetry and a fellowship to the Virginia Center for the Creative Arts, Kathy has also awarded a writing grant from the Elgin Cox Trust. She is taught at the Writer Center at the Chautauqua Institute in upstate New York, the New York State Young Writers Program at Skidmore, as well as in the Poets in the School programs of New Hampshire and Massachusetts. In 2004, she held the position of Visiting Research Associate at the Brandeis University Women's Studies Research Center in Waltham, Massachusetts. In addition to teaching at the Solstice Low Residency MFA program, Kathleen teaches for Changing Lives Through Literature, an alternative sentencing program based on the power of books to change lives through reading and group discussion. She's a consulting editor in poetry for the Kenyon Review. And then Jennifer Martelli, she, her, hers, is the author of The Queen of Queens and My Tarantella, awarded an honorable mention from the Italian American Studies Association, selected as a must-read by the Massachusetts Center for the Book, and named as a finalist for the Housatonic Book Award. She's also the author of the chapbooks In the Year of Ferraro from Nix's Mate Press and Afterbird, winner of the Gray Book Press Open Reading. Her work has appeared in the Academy of American Poets Poem a Day, Poetry, the Tahoma Literary Review, the Sycamore Review, Cream City Review, Verse Daily, Iron Horse Review, winner of the Photo Finish Contest, and elsewhere. Jennifer has twice received grants from the Massachusetts Cultural Council for her poetry, and she is the co-poetry editor for Mom Egg Review. So without that, I'm very happy to welcome both Kathleen and Jennifer and give them a welcoming snaps. Here we go. Okay, add spotlight. And add slide.
There we are. Thank you, Lisa and Becca, so much for having us here. I'm really excited to speak with Jennifer Martelli, whose book and poems I just adore. And thank all the rest of you for coming here when you could be home biting your nails and watching MSNBC. I mean, you are at home, but we decided we would begin, each of us would read 2 poems by the other person. That seems somehow significant, as a significant way to start off the conversation. So I'd like to begin with the first poem in Jen's book, 16 Reasons I Became a Gray Pearl. I grew tired of being a grain of irritation in the world's soft palette. Thought I'd be a moon floating in a cloudy afternoon sky. 3, being asexual, I craved bondage. 4, craved 4 gold prongs to hold me in place on a band for the left ring finger. 5, needed to backhand someone right on the mouth. 6, felt silky, felt smooth. 7, felt unsure, so I committed to pescatarianism. 8, bounced like an idea and got lost. 9, was pried from my hinged jewel casket with a flat shucking knife. 10, wanted to be shucked so bad. 11, wanted sisters. 12, wanted to be drilled and strung on a gold chain. 13, wanted to tink tink against another bead. 14, wanted to hang around a woman's neck. 15, wanted to taste her sweat. 16, wanted to be dropped in a glass of red wine vinegar to see if I was pure enough to dissolve. I wanted to dissolve. And the other poem I want to read is Why I Began Writing About Vice Presidential Candidate Geraldine Ferraro, because the title of the book is Queen of Queens, which someone had kind of nicknamed Geraldine Ferraro. Why I began writing about Vice Presidential Candidate Geraldine Ferraro. Behind Commonwealth Avenue, next to the old domed temple, they turned into an observatory. The theater premiered Flashdance. After that, no one wore a sweatshirt without the neck hole torn to the shoulder knobs. Like Jennifer Beals, who unhooked her bra, pulled it from the sleeve without ever breaking eye contact. Someone smarter than I must know how many times I've orbited over 3 decades. Everything then is happening again. Back in the 80s, a rich man raped his first wife, and now I have to look at his face every day. Last night, I streamed Jennifer Beals on all my devices. How I love her every move. Of course, she was a welder during the daytime. I took the one freshman in my dorm who looked like the steel mill owner up to my single room. What I mean is, when my joints pop, when I'm like a maniac on the floor, ghosts come. I don't come to anything in quiet. Maybe it was there on the cold linoleum, maybe against the cinder block bricks. Maybe it was in the towers with the stupid boy on top of me that I was hopeful I could conjure anybody or thing I wanted. And Jen, I've already forgotten whether we're going to talk about those poems now.
I know. We have this all planned and now we both forgot it. It's so nice to hear my poems in your voice though. I want to say that. It's wonderful. I want to jump. Do you mind if I jump in and read yours, Kathy?
No,
because I'm so excited.
Clearly,
and
anything we've already gotten.
I do want to. Thank Lisa and Becca for inviting us, and it's really a joy to be discussing these poems with Kathy. I love this book, and it was so many. First of all, I had picked so many poems in the book. I said, well, I'll be reading the whole book, but I wanted to start start with two poems from the middle section, Kathy, from the self-portraits, for two reasons. First, I feel like that whole section was a spine in the book, like a true backbone of the book. But also, I think, Becca, you mentioned that we are part of a writing group in Salem. And I remember these poems. I remember you bringing these poems to a workshop. And I think that they're beautiful, but I also think that they sort of trace the arc of this book, which we'll talk about. So I'm going to read two. And the first one is Self-Portrait as Sun-Washed, which begins with an epigraph from the Benjamin Moore online paint catalog. A watery whisper soft shade, this lovely pale peaches reminiscent of fine vintage lace and heirloom embroidery. Self-portrait as sun-washed. So pale, maybe about to faint would be a better name, or pink shirt washed too many times. Unlike the sun, this color lacks conviction. Name it boring day in a long marriage, daily chores. Name it me at a liminal time in my life, or neither here nor there. Name it too timid to be seen, nearly invisible, woman past the middle of her life. And to follow up with that, which I love how you did this, is Self-Portrait as Sunrise. Here I am, can girl, high kicking night out of the sky. Coral skirts, hot pink feather boa, arms draped across that electric navy horizon. Dazzle dance, quick flirt, fade, and gather my skirts into that spiked circle children paint in the corner of their pictures. That thing you think you know. Oh, I love that ending. That thing you think you know.
Well, it's interesting because we both have self-portraits in the book. We have two. One, the self-portrait, I don't remember the exact title, is A Cherry Tree in Your Backyard. And then your final poem, Forgetting, is also a self-portrait. And then we also have, which I think is in both of those poems about feeling muted or being silenced or
yes,
and then poems about kind of bursting out.
Right.
Yeah. And I think I had read the Ferraro poem in the 16 Reasons I Became a Great Pearl for different reasons, but I want to point out that number 16 is in some ways about silencing or disappearing, wanted to be dropped in a glass of red wine vinegar to see if I was pure enough to dissolve. I wanted to dissolve. And I think that has something in common with at least the one self-portrait poem you read. But there are two things that those poems bring up. One thing I love about your book, Jen, is the way you have these motifs. I think about the pearls, the ghosts, the women speaking through you. And how did you come to those? And how did you use them to kind of tie your book together? Because they run through so many poems, and also the silencing. Yeah.
So, I was talking about this in this other interview, that this book did not start out with noble purposes. I think I was listening to, I might have been listening to the theme from Flashdance. I might have heard it somewhere. And I was thinking about the 80s, which is, when I first started voting, and I thought about Geraldine Ferraro, and I think that was my first or second presidential election. And the pearls came in because if you look at pictures, especially from when she accepted the nomination, she wore pearls, and that was a very 80s, bit of accessory, the pearl. People wore fake pearls and these long pearls and big giant pearls. So that image just stuck with me throughout the book. And then, the book felt circular to me, and I want to talk about your structure too. I mean, just one of my concerns in the book was that the poem you chose, Kathy, everything then was happening again. And I started writing this before the pandemic. And yes, Jonathan just put that in the chat. Yeah, right. Madeleine Albright's lapel pins, Nancy Pelosi's beads, you know.
Yeah.
But there were all these repetition of people, like actual political characters, and I liked the roundness of the pearl, so that's where that came in, and that image, and that was just. Sometimes, I don't know if you find this, because I was thinking about this too in your book, and that's why I picked those two poems, because of your use of colors throughout the book. Sometimes for me, anyway, an image or a color to continue that throughout a book is a good way, to continue writing in that vein. You know, I have that as my tether, my rope pull throughout the book. And what I loved about, just this luxuriating in color that you do in those two self-portrait poems, and is your poem 16 months brown and gold.
Oh, yeah.
Your use of color there. So I don't know if it's too much to jump into that, but I found that just such a brilliant use of color. On so many levels, which brings us sort of to a political aspect, which we were talking about too.
That was a tough poem because I think I might have been talking to you about this. Unless you know that I'm a white grandmother with a brown grandson, I don't think it has the same resonance. And I didn't know how to get that in. At one point, I had my white hand holding your brown hand. It just was clunky. And then Richard, my husband suggested, well, just do one of those long titles that everybody uses now. White grandmother. In the end, I just went with, the 16 months brown and gold. But I always feel nervous that maybe the point won't come through. I wasn't sure. That the white fence and the brown hand and not turning whatever color during a tantrum from brown to blue would do it, but I hope so. I
think that it would be great for you to read that, just so I guess people can tell. It's hard for me to say because I do know your grandson, but to me, it's just it's a brilliant use of color throughout the poem, and you do this throughout the book, and I don't know. I think it works.
So funny, Jen, though, because you seem much more conscious of the motifs you use than I was. I mean, with me, it's always an accident, lucky or not. Okay. At 16 months, brown and gold. My grandson plucks a marigold poking through a neighbor's fence, crushes it between his fingers, while I try to remember if it's poisonous. 3 days later, he's alive. So I crossed the marigold off my list of potentially lethal flora toddlers might put in their mouths. So far, he has not harmed himself by falling while carrying a stick and poking out his eye, something my mother assured me would happen if I ever ran with a stick in my hand. Though he tugs hard at the baby gate, he has not pulled it down. Though he has banged on the window, he has not shattered it, cut himself, or fallen to the pavement 2 stories below. His skin has not turned from brown to blue during a tantrum, and he has grabbed the dog's whiskers without being bitten. He bulldozes his way. He prods and he pushes. He tries to put the whole of the dangerous world in his mouth while I follow, ready to snatch the worst away. When tired, he wobbles, he falls, he cries, but the next day he's walking again. Golden marigold petals stain his brown hand as he carries his stick. So far, no one thinks it's a gun. I was also thinking about the way you interweave your own life with the political themes in the book. Even like the Geraldine Ferraro poem that we looked at, you have this amazing thing you do with titles. So the title tells us what the poem is about, but the poem doesn't exactly mention it. So with why I began writing about Vice Presidential Geraldine Ferraro, I mean, it's that title that, gives that last line, 2 lines that I was hopeful I could conjure anybody or thing I wanted. And you do that with a lot of other ones. Let me see, the one I'm thinking of is at the corner of Jacinto and Camille Roads, Revere, Massachusetts. So it begins with this epigraph. Maybe you'll read this poem on
Sure.
page 42.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's the epigraph that gives the poem its context and its meaning. Otherwise, I mean, it would be a wonderful poem, but it wouldn't have that other ramification.
Right.
So you do so much work with your titles and these epigraphs that allow you to bring all kinds of other things into the political realm of your poetry. I really admire that.
Right. Well, in terms of, I don't know, I just kind of learned this whole term, the whole idea of docu-poetry. Like, I thought this was just a project book. And then I learned that I was writing docu-poetry. That's so wonderful. But, just the whole idea of taking, well, you do it too in your book when I think about it, but just it's the title of your book, of taking non-literary, sources and kind of reinterpreting it. In a way, it's almost like an ekphrastic experience.
Yeah.
So, so I guess like my purpose, and I'll read this poem. I wanted to have the epigraphs, and I use them a lot in this book, even more than my Tarantella. But to just sort of interweave I had no interest in writing a historical book, right? I mean, people do that a lot better than I ever would. So this is how this experience of nominating the first woman, to an executive office, and how this was rejected by the country, how this affected me, So anyway, so this poem, I'm really bad at titles, so sometimes I do default to that. This is a poem about. This has an epigraph. It's a quote from Geraldine Ferraro. I didn't expect the majority of the Italian American community to abandon me by their silence. And the reason why they did was because she was pro-choice. She, strongly pro-choice. At the corner of Assunta and Camille Roads, Revere, Massachusetts, a small gray pregnant cat was lifted by the talons of a hawk. The brown and white bird carried its prey past the overgrown blue fir and the afternoon moon, which loomed like Mary's breast, pressed against the sky window. As the cat flew, she watched the low-pitched roofs of the new ranches, the dugout foundations, homes she would never live in. The moon surrendered itself to this tableau. The gray cat, the hawk that had never been seen before in this neighborhood, all the hunger. Weeks earlier, some boys caught that golden black snake dangling deep within the blue fir's branches. She would visit from the dugout pond where houses would go. They chased her until she wore out from reticulation, her long spine unable to move quick like brain waves in a dream. I can barely write this. The boys looped her into a brown lunch bag, doused it with gas, lit it on fire. The cat did not see this, and the hawk, alighting by the muddy pond, released her. She stepped from under its wing, uncertain. I still don't know if this was a dream or a memory. The cat, the black and gold snake. There was charred skin. There were tire strips. There was a laboring cat. The whole neighborhood, nascent, silent.
I think that's so brilliant, the way you take your epigraph about being abandoned and turn it to this other example. And we're not going to talk about the Kitty Genovese book, but everyone should buy it because there's so much about silencing in that book. And if you don't mind, you have with regards to the silencing, I wrote these quotes down from your Madonna triptych. You write, "Even in my dreams, I feared no one would ever hear me."
Yeah.
And in Oracula, oracular. You read, you were heard, they said you were beautiful, but that's a poem with taking drugs in it, right? Is that?
Yeah, right. Well, that's the 80s. That's where that
The 80s.
comes in.
It's true. I don't know, that goes on, this business of speaking and not speaking, and under what
Right.
circumstances you can speak. I'm going to ask you to read one more poem, and then I'll let you have a turn
Okay.
to take this hour over. There's so many things I'd like to talk about. But this poem, Tongue Root, because it has so many things in it about your background in life, about conjuring, which you use, and the women that people don't hear, and your own speaking. If you don't mind, you want the page? 26.
Sorry, everything. Am I freezing, by the way?
No, am I?
Yeah, every now and then, like this, it freezes. So I never know if it's my freezing.
I think it's you freezing, just like a little blip, not anything.
Okay.
Because I know that the internet and the reception in Salem is often a little tricky.
Yeah. I'm just looking at Laurel's question. Can I
Sure
just talk about that for 1 second? Is that okay, Becca?
Yeah,
if I just
absolutely.
jump in. This is a really interesting question. So Laurel Benjamin asked, isn't docu-poetry more like poems that use current events? Not all the time. That's what I thought it was. And actually what I thought it was probably more interesting than what it really is. I thought it was, you have these collections that incorporate video and, all these different layerings. In its purest definition, docu-poetry is just poetry that relies on non-literary sources, so you might be using erasures from a speech, okay, and it might be an older speech. In fact, Tracy K. Smith does that, doesn't she do that with the Declaration of Independence? So she's taking something that is non-literary and incorporating it into a literary form that, you say like has the speaker's voice, is made relevant to the story. So, yeah, that's, and again, as I say, I didn't know I was doing that.
Oh, just to like tag onto that, Jonathan had asked this earlier. The comparison of docu-poetry to ekphrastic poetry is fascinating.
Yeah.
But I'm also reminded of Allen Ginsberg. Wouldn't poems like Howl and Kaddish be a form of docu-poetry?
I'm trying to think of
saw the best minds of my generation. Beginning of Howl.
I'm trying to, I'd have to look, I would have to look at both of those poems. I mean, when I think of docu-poetry or the way, it's used now, okay? Let me say that. It's again, taking like, just these sources and building them into the poem, so I'm What do you think, Kathy? I mean, would you consider those poems?
I mean, first,
that's a good question.
I always thought I didn't understand docu-poetry, so I thought it was a much more kind of rigid and narrow definition. So would any poem about a current event or current situation be considered docu-poetry? In that sense, maybe Howl, because he's talking about what goes on. Kaddish, I don't remember as clearly. I know it was for his mother, but I don't remember if there's other kind of information, other situations that he bounces off in that poem.
Right. Yeah, I would say the same thing. I can't, I'm not as familiar with, I don't remember it as well. I should say that. But when I think of docu-poetry, I mean, the way I'm understanding it now, it's actually like literally taking this thing, Oliver de la Paz does some great poems using, forms from his kids' school, so you have the structure of like a questionnaire, like a true questionnaire, this is taken, and then you're answering it, the poet answers it in a much more literary way.
Jim, what about your poem, which is a political poem, right, about the number 16? So in it, you have all those facts about number 16. It's not a response to an event, but would you consider that a kind of docu-poetry, or are we stretching this definition?
I mean, that might be stretching it. I would think more of the erasure that I have in the book, which is, they're not always great to read. That's the thing is too, like vice presidential, the acceptance speech, you know what I mean? Where I'm doing this backwards. I'm actually like taking this form and like crossing out. So like an erasure, an erasure. Isabel O'Hare did this whole collection of erasures on, men. It was right after the first of the Me Too era, the beginning of that, men who apologized for their behaviors, and she just, would erase these. And, so when I think of docu-poetry, I mean, it's more than just, I'm just, writing about something that's happening. I'm actually using the structure in the book, so that's how I think of it. But, I don't, I'm not sure about that. I see, like phrases, one creativity prompting the generation of another. Yeah. I mean, I if you think of it like as a response or something. So,
Is it usually?
So I mean, in a way, I mean, I was going to jump to this. The name of your book, World Happiness Index. I mean, that in a way, I mean, you're taking this from a non-literary document. The World Happiness Index is something that wasn't written as literature, but you make it yours. And just in terms of our conversation too about voice and silencing, I mean, this book that poem is hilarious, and it's so heartbreaking and so wry, and I can hear your voice, Kathy, as you're reading it. I mean, would you mind reading that?
Oh, not at all. I mean, it doesn't really have any facts in it, except maybe that we were in 2019, the 19th happiest country. But Finland's always number one. World Happiness Index 2019. How happy I am to live in the 19th happiest country in the world. Tulips rose this month through the arsenic soil, and the air I breathe is dark with money. In country 19, we can say what we want. A professor in California is allowed to say we elected a racist president, and those who disagree can leave phone messages threatening his 9-year-old daughter because we live free or die. Our children leave their houses each morning happy, not knowing what adventures the day holds. Might they be shot on the sidewalk by an officer who mistakes their cell phone for a gun, or by a stray bullet in the playground? Or will they get to school where they can hide in the closet from an active shooter? If they arrive home safely, there's always tomorrow, and maybe tomorrow the teachers will have guns. They are happy to be living in this just happy enough country where no one dares get sick for fear of bankruptcy. If you try in happy country 19, you too can be rich as the sea. And if not, there are lots of street corners to live on and happy things to swallow or snort. And the fetid air from the subway grate will keep you warm at night if you knock someone else off it playing King of the Mountain. We have problems, of course, that we're trying to solve, but we're from the country of hard work and
I'll be in 3 minutes.
of take what you want and say it was yours all along. Numbers 1, 2, and 3, with their orderly lives, their health care and housing and good schools for free, grow soft and mushy. Not us. We're the ice inside a snowball, the rubber hose that leaves no mark. We dance on the head of uncertainty, cruelty's pin. Every morning, our sun rises, red, white, and blue.
The voice in that is just, it really is amazing. And in a way, again, this is a response to, to a very real, this index, this World Happiness Index, which I didn't know existed until I read this poem, Kathy, by the way. Can I just ask you about when you wrote this? Like, was it before COVID, or I know you talk about COVID in here.
2019.
Oh, 2019 Dura. Okay, of
Oh,
course, of
So
course.
that
But
was
it,
before, but
yeah,
it was when all the Trump had been elected and there were all those shootings, and the detail about the professor in California is true. He said
right.
we had a racist president and people were threatening him. They had to park their, I mean, I had more details about that because it was so shocking. They had to park their car somewhere else, different
Yeah,
every day, so that
yeah.
they wouldn't get bombed.
Do you ever wonder? I mean, I've been asked this question again, especially the first part of this book is, it's very, very political, which I love. I mean, on a personal level, I love that. Obviously my book is, highly political. You know how I feel about things. I know how you feel. And I would know this even if I didn't know you. Let me say that. Have you ever worried, I mean, in terms of voice, or just using your voice, have you ever worried that this would in some way alienate a reader, like somebody to be like, you know what, like it is live free or die, or
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, especially putting this poem first. Had a lot of support for doing it, but I felt it was a risky
yeah,
thing to put first because it could alienate people before they got any further in the book. And I think I
right.
told this story a million times, but the first reading I gave from this book was on Zoom, and a gentleman said afterwards, he was being humorous, "But you seem like such a nice person." But I mean, you do that too, Jan. I mean, your voice is like, um, it's tough, it's rough, it's tough. I mean, it's tough. I mean, it's strong. Like I'm trying to think of one of the million. Well, like I know I love this poem, and it is in the end, I think, a political poem. Um, Let me find it. The one about being in the North End.
Oh, right, right. Let me just grab that one.
I
It's a
have that
prose
one on my
poem.
list. It just
The Angels of Hanover Street.
yeah, the angels
Yeah,
on the street.
yeah,
Because it seems like a description of the North End, and then it just ends with this very strong feminist statement.
right, right. Well, it's funny. Part of this book too was just an exploration of my own. I'm a third generation Italian, and I grew up in a very Italian area neighborhood. And going back and forth to my own experience, and Geraldine Ferraro running, how she didn't get support from that, from that community at all. And this poem, this poem had been written out a million times, and it's one of those poems that's very, very true. It came. I don't believe poems have to be true. I want to say this. I think that there can be, poetry is not it. Poetry is fiction in a lot of ways, but sometimes the poetry gods are good, and will hand you something. So, a lot of people, the Godfather as a book and a movie, is problematic. I mean, I know a lot of people who just won't watch it. They just feel it. It just says terrible things about Italians. And I think what a lot of people miss too is just its response to women and the minor characters in there. In this, so anyway, so this is a prose poem. You won't really hear line breaks, but it has an epigraph by Mario Puzo, and she let him control her limbs and her body. The Angels of Hanover Street. I'm finishing a late supper with Lorette and Julia and Diana at Ricardo's next to the Italian-American bookstore in Boston's North End. The white tablecloth is stained with circles, purple wine, gold olive oil, black coffee. Lorette says she will never watch or read The Godfather. I tell them the first time I snuck that book into my bed and read the sex scene, I thought Sonny Corleone broke the hip bones of Lucy Mancini. When I read blood-gorged pole of muscle, I thought he was bleeding. When I read Shattering Climax, I thought pieces of her bones splattered across her silk maid of honor gown. I didn't know how things in a woman really could be broken. The doctor who tightened Lucy down there with loops of surgical thread so she could constrict around him called her poor, benighted Italian girl. I say, well, maybe The Godfather is an ink blot test for Italians. In the book, Don Corleone said, women and children can afford to be careless, men cannot. I love it here in the oldest part of the city, the sticky, sweet streets, the lights lit all year, the little girl tinsel angels dangling from hooks.
Yeah, I mean, by itself, it's a wonderful poem, but in the context of the book, where you have all these references to, abortions and abortions being outlawed and, women being silenced, it's particularly powerful, especially that last line. I would love you to talk a little bit. One of the poems I thought of was Tongue Root. I don't know if you want to read it, but you talk about women speaking through you. There you said, what I conjured then I live with now. I conjured women nobody heard. And the poem takes place originally when you're a child. And then many poems you have women speaking through you.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that theme and the ghosts? And they seem so real.
Yeah, it's interesting. So one of the characters in this book, so you have Geraldine Ferraro, and you have she's obviously the center, my concern. But there's also this character of the Strega, which I guess is witch, or seer, or just somebody who conjured, who conjured things, futures, curses, spirits. So, I would never, be so bold as to say, I was speaking, for all these women, in the past. I don't feel that way, but I feel that, there is a collective trauma, that I was feeling. And again, I don't want to speak for every woman, but I guess I began to articulate it after the election of 2016, which, in so many ways was about silencing. And for me anyway, and for a lot of women I spoke to, I think we've talked about this, Kathleen, just that trauma and everything, that we've seen since. So when I was writing this book, it was, before the pandemic, before Kamala Harris and all this, and it was just sort of all this. A major part of this book, anyway, was just sort of this whole idea of, of the silencing of women, and that's where Tongue Root came from. And the conversation was with our friend Jennifer Jean, and
right.
Speaking that way, and again, it's another hybrid poem. But I think it's interesting that we both wrote these books, with these, political leanings, and they all deal on some level with women, the silencing of women. I'm thinking too, in the wonderful poem you read with your grandson at 16 months with sticking flowers in his mouth, that comes up again in the in your self-portrait section. In self-portrait, mute self-portrait.
Oh, yeah.
We have another flower in the mouth.
Yeah,
which is wonderful.
I didn't even know that, Jen.
There's complete balance throughout this book, and I hope we have time, because I think everybody has to hear about the brilliant structure. Which mimics this young, wonderful man balancing on a scooter
I gave it
over the landscape.
Well, after the 2016 election, some people responded by writing, and I just felt I had no language, I had no words,
right.
Silenced in a personal way. Not yours is a more, when I read your book anyway, it feels not just personal, but often for a lot of women. For me, I felt very, very personally silenced in a way I couldn't
Yeah.
write. I didn't know what to say.
Can I ask you to read two poems then, which are about that? Do you mind? The first one is Mute Self-Portrait on page 36.
Alrighty.
And the other one is, oh my gosh. What's the other one that no, that's not it. Fear Street on page 13.
Okay.
Would you mind? Because I think they do this. They're, this these poems about this fear of impotency, like not having the agency. So would you mind? I'm sorry to like throw two on your lap, Kath.
You beat me to it. I was going to ask you to rate about 5, but anyway, Mute Self-Portrait. If only a hibiscus bloomed from my mouth, if my words persuaded like ice in a heat wave, my voice poured like a waterfall down a silver slope, and a hurricane roared from my throat. But not this stuck stone, this mouth filled with grit. When I speak, sand floats through the air, and the room is covered with dust. And the other poem,
so wonderful.
There's Fear Street. Oh, 13.
13.
Yeah. Fear Street. I lived on Main Street in a quiet city where citizens spoke kindly of those they didn't have to live with. But underneath every complacent surface is a set of fangs, sharp and growing sharper, hungry, irritable, insatiable. How suddenly it seemed to draw back its lips. I didn't see it coming. They said, that's because you didn't have to. It wasn't gnawing on you. How indignant I was on their behalf. How I loved my indignation. They rolled their eyes at my innocence, which was expensive and costing their lives. But I'd never hurt you, I said. We all live on Fear Street, they replied, but you couldn't read the sign. We're all being swallowed. Go ahead. If you don't believe us, walk into its maw.
Oh, that line. But underneath every complacent surface is a set of fangs, sharp and growing sharper. It's just wonderful.
What did you see, Jen, as the connection between those two poems?
Well, there's so much, again, about the mouth. That's the first thing, what goes in and out of the mouth, what you're able to take in through the mouth, which is, such a primal way of, taking outside, bringing that inside, even more than sight. It's really, through the mouth in a very childish way, as you make reference to your grandson putting things, which may be poison. Mouth being violent, mouth being silent, and then the silencing. Just getting words out, wanting to and not being able to. Like Street Sonnet, where you have that wonderful woman who's like swearing and giving everybody the finger and just being angry. So
we don't want
that. I feel like that's me. That's going to be me. But give me a few years and then I'm like, oh. So that's, the obvious connection between those two. And this, I could have chosen a lot of poems, but these two also. You do this throughout the whole book, and I love it. It's this layering of realities, where you have, we both live, you live in Salem, I'm right next to Salem. So you have, all the, what's going on in Salem, and then the hard truth below it, what it's really about, which is the poem, To the Children. So you have Halloween and, we're doing all this stuff. And then you have children in cages and, what's really, and where the whole Halloween thing came from. Happy Skies, you do it again. And then later on in the book, and if you'd love to read it, I love this poem, is Liberty Hotel. That's not later on. It's the painting by Quentin Oliver Jones, but Liberty Hotel is a great example of that, where you have these realities going on. So that's why those two poems, and especially Fear Street, that these things we don't speak of, there, here's the surface, here's the sidewalk, and I don't like, just, I'm so moved by this cover, this photograph. And then there's all the hidden stuff that will, throw you off the scooter and make you fall. So that was the connection between those two poems for me.
Well, you mentioned the cover. I have to plug Glenn McClure again.
Yeah.
Website, everybody. It's funny that you mentioned the dry dock poem, but I wrote that in the class you taught, right? Did you teach? You taught a class on ekphrastic poetry at the Athenaeum.
The Quentin Jones poem. Yeah, right, on page 70. That's a beautiful poem. But then you do this again too with the dry dock poem. You have the two realities too, with your father and where he is and what might be happening. I think it's with the dry dock poem.
Yeah, it does. It does. At one point, I think I was reading Betsy Scholl's book, the one that has all the poems based on jazz, and I just was so.
Yeah.
She pulls everything in.
Yeah.
Martina Spada has some poems like that. So it's really moving quickly, and yet it all winds up. And I wanted to learn to do something like that. I don't know that I did, but I wanted to open my poems and bring more in. I mean, the way you do, you've got the political, the personal, everything kind of mixed up. And then another thing you do, Jen, though, I really want to talk about, because I'm interested in the way your mind is working when you write these poems. So take the poem, there's a bunch like this, but let's just take the poem Strega on page 24. If you wouldn't mind reading it, I feel like you do this leaping imagery. I think, how does she get to that place? And how does it all somehow fit together? What an imagination, what a mental facility. And you do that shout, you do that in a couple of poems, but maybe we could look at Strega, if you don't mind reading.
Sure. Strega. Long ago, when I needed to be numb, I offered my loves clear broth in mercury glass bowls, so they never knew what they held, and I could read their emotions in degrees Fahrenheit. Now I bring myself to every place I go, sure that my body is 60% salt water, 40% deserted island. A woman waits in the field that grows along my diaphragm. She holds a yellow snake with pearly pink eyes. I can hear the blades of grass groan. Someday, before I end, I'll leave that island, sail to the colony in my belly, or maybe swim to the kidney-shaped grotto. And I'll own what's there. Understand that if you cut me in half, one of my sisters will grow, that sometimes I am my children, and those times are the most painful. As I'm reading that, I'm just remembering, I'm like, when did I write this? And I was doing a workshop online. It was a prompt from Jessica Furtado about using tarot as a prompt. And all the different ways you can interpret tarot. I'm not a card reader, but we live among many of them in our neighborhood. So I'm not sure which card I pulled, but these, like the image with the yellow snake with pearly pink eyes, that's what came with that. But again, what I was doing in this book was just searching for the interior, using the interior to search, in a way for the political, that was what was happening there.
But I mean, your images, so you go from, the clear broth in Fahrenheit.
Yeah.
You're talking about your body, 60% salt water, 60% deserted island. And then the woman in the diaphragm. And somehow it all works. It really works, but the images are so disparate and kind of loosely associative. And another thing that interests me is that, you have some poems in your book that are kind of, indented lines and take up more space between lines. This poem associates a lot and jumps a lot, but the form is pretty contained, left-hand margin and everything else.
Right.
Was it deliberate?
So what I really wanted, when I was putting this book together, and this is great because now we can talk about book organization a little bit, because I do want to talk about yours. I have no sense of how to put a book of poetry together. No sense of that at all. And I hope you'll all, answer questions. Okay. So the first thing I was concerned with in this book, I didn't want the poems to all look the same. I had just finished reading Yona Harvey's You Don't Have to Go to Mars to Fall in Love. And I just loved how the poems looked. Just every poem just looked different. And there was a lot of space. No, you had some really condensed, thick poems, but that was my first concern with this book. I wanted them to look a certain way. So this book, again, it's tighter. It's a little bit, like more like poemy looking, for lack of a better term. It's not really written in form, but I was careful with the lines. I wanted images on the same line, and that's sort of how I thought I could control some of the leaps with that.
Yeah.
But yeah, so if you look at the next page, this is a much like airy poem with longer lines and more white space. And if anybody ever wants to give me a private tutorial, just hit me up, just DM me. But I really used her book as a model. Obviously I gave it to people. I think we used a couple of the same people to look it over and, to get suggestions, but I let them know this was really important to me. I wanted it to look kind of watery in a way, if that makes any sense, which leads me to a question for you, because I think your book could be a masterclass in book organization. And I mean that. And even when I was reading it to review it.
I didn't organize it myself. I mean, I did organize it. And everybody in the Longtime Writers Workshop group, we go way back, helped me organize it. And then in the end, I gave it to MP Carver. Organization.
MP Carver.
I don't think she drastically revised it, but she had a lot of good ideas, and she made the 3 sections and put the self-portrait in the middle. Because I'm not good at organizing my own books. I don't know if I've ever organized a book that was the final organization. If the editor didn't reorganize it, somebody else did. That's the honest answer. How did you organize?
I just want to say this, really, you should do a class and use your book. So, you have these poems that are all at the beginning, all like in Salem and, as a parent and a grandparent, then all these self-portraits, these very inner, and then it comes out and you're back to like sort of another real landscape, as a daughter, as a caregiver, hospitals. But there's more, a little bit more of reclaiming the voice. And I just, again, I loved reading that. Like, it was so satisfying, and say like, okay, we're going on a scooter ride and we need balance, and, we're going to enter this place of self-portrait and come out on this other end, which I love.
When you organized your book, how did you do it? Were you conscious of like, okay, I got pearls here, I'll put another pearls, or I'll move some pearls further on, or, did you look for similarities between poems or differences?
What I did, my first organization, and again, there are things that change, but even though I don't have sections in this book, in my mind, I organized it in 3 sections also. And I had, it ends, I originally had ended this poem. The penultimate and final poem were transposed in mine. So it ended in water in my take, and in the editor's take, it ended in air. It ended in breath. you know. So the book began with dissolving in liquid, and then I had it in liquid again, and this one sent it off into the air a little bit.
Interesting. Yeah.
So it was much more, it was organized through sort of like tactile, like wet air, and then I'm trying, oh no, gosh, I can't even think of it. It was so long ago. It was like, by the time, it actually comes out, there was water, breath, and like stars, like constellations, nighttime, the night sky, because there was a lot of that going on.
They always have some reference, just, like you have the titles that give us the poem, and they don't seem anything to do with each other. The poem isn't about the title, but the title absolutely informs the poem. And so your description of the structure reminds me of, I wouldn't guess that, but it absolutely informs the whole book. Yeah.
Right. Well, I think this is the tough thing with organizing a manuscript, though. It's, there are some that are very, some manuscripts, it's very obvious. And, there wasn't really a biographical link, I didn't really have a timeline to work through. So it felt more elemental as I was writing. I don't know if anybody else in the audience, in writing or putting together poems, like these poems felt like objects to me, like pearls or water, or, whatever. So, yeah.
Great. Did we get a note that we're supposed to do questions now?
Well, we actually
questions, I know.
We do have a question from from Carol. She sent a note saying, where did it go? I just had it.
Oh, I see it.
How important is the visual presentation of your words? Is that in your thoughts or is that the poet's job?
Well, I think so. Jen, you answer too. Yeah. When I think about the line break, I'm thinking about the last word and the pace of the poem, but there are decisions like, do you want the poem to look tidy? Kind of all it's about the same. Sorry, I have my finger in a cast. It looks very weird. Or do you want them to be uneven for some reason? So there is a little bit, but Jen, I think even more so with you, because your poems are spread out across the page in certain instances.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And the other aspect of poetry, I'm so embarrassed to say this, that defies me, and eludes me sometimes, the whole idea of line breaks, you know what I mean? I tend to go for a longer line, but that's not always the right impulse. Sometimes that's default for me, like put it in these long couplets, like everything's in a couplet, So, but I think that is a really, really good question in terms of, Carol, I don't know if you meant just individual poems or poems in a collection, but I know lately I've been wanting to write what I call thicker poems, you know what I mean? I want them a little bit more dense. I think that's because I'm reading Erica Meitner, so I want them to be, these thicker kind of stanzas, or just a little bit tighter in their look, but that does play a part for me anyway.
It's in a way you feel like, I feel like couplets today. But
yeah,
I'm reading this book by Victoria Chang, Obit. Maybe some of you have read it. And all the poems are like kind of like obituaries or something. Yeah. So I think the way a poem looks does matter. And you think about a John Ashbery poem, one of those really long, dense poems, and you're thinking, okay, do I have the courage? Do I have the wherewithal to get through this? And some days you want to, and other days you'd rather have little William Carlos Williams over quick. Williams, that's wrong. He's wrote Patterson, he wrote epics, but I think I know the way the poem looks on the page has an effect on the way it's read.
And I think too, in terms of, I'm sorry, yeah.
No, I was just going to say that Eileen asked a question about, can you talk about the forms in the books? Like what forms you use in particular?
Do you, I
I'd be
use,
idiots to either of them. Either.
okay. I don't necessarily, I don't always write in form. I mean, that isn't my go-to, but I did use, I used two main forms in this book, and they're both invented forms. And one of them was the duplex, which was invented by Jericho Brown. And he was generous and brilliant enough when I emailed him to email back with instructions. What? Hello. And it's a lot of fun. It's, you know, and again, he invented this form. And I like the circularity of it. And the other one I used, I want to say it was Diane Seuss did not invent this form, but she was the one who introduced it to me, which was a sonnet. She didn't invent the sonnet, but in her, I always blank on the name of her, not Frank, the book before it, what is it? The Peacock and Dead Peacock. She uses those American sentences, which are 14-line poems. Each line has 17 syllables. And that really worked for me. And I've used that form a lot. I love that. So I use that in the book. I also have a few cannibalized because I can't write a villanelle or a pantoum. You have a beautiful villanelle in your book, Kathy. Which, and so the things that started out as villanelles, like oracular, that started out as a really bad villanelle. And then I kind of took it out of that form. So anyway, yeah.
Well, in this book, I have two sonnets. And they all have, I think they're all 14 lines, iambic pentameter, one might rhyme, one might not. I like the sonnet because I like the turn and I like the argument. And I like the forms that the duplexes you used a lot, Jen. In fact, I was going to ask you to read one of them before we ran out of time. But in an earlier book I wrote, Daughter of, I had a lot more forms. I had villanelles. I had a couple of villanelles. I had some sonnets. I had some forms I kind of made up because a lot of the poems in that book dealt with myth, and that has all these poems about Miranda from Shakespeare's The Tempest. So it seemed more fitting. The thing about form is I sometimes I call them ghost forms. You start with a form, but the form's not working. And I think the poem is more important than the form. And so if the form, it's like the skeleton of a house, you can't see it, but it's there in some fashion. But I wish I felt more adept in form. I've written some poems in form, but I don't feel like that they come easily. I think they're a little labored for me often.
I love that idea though of the ghost form, because I have so many poems in here that are failed forms. But they're failed forms. They started out as one thing. And then I just said, this just isn't working. And as you say, the more important thing is the poem, than the form, sometimes the form is a good exercise too.
It is. Yeah. I mean, as a way, just to give yourself a little distance from something, and sometimes just to get yourself writing, that you're using language in a new way. And I always regret that I didn't take a course in writing in form. There was one offered in graduate school, and I wish I had taken it because I feel like it's a tool I should have more practice at. So I actually took Mary Kinsey's book, The Art of Poetry or something like that. And it's about, I worked through all the exercises in writing in form as a way to get a little bit more comfortable with it.
We should do that. That's like a great prompt though, to have like this weird, like form writing,
well, do you remember
regimen?
There is a villanelle in here, and it came from that workshop Jonah did. She's a genius at that stuff. Remember, she had us write, and then she listened and heard a line that was iambic pentameter and said, "Okay, there you begin with your villanelle." And
she's brilliant. That was so much fun. That's right. And she had us go up on the board, and she's like, "That's iambic." She just has this ear for it. That's amazing. Yeah, that's a beautiful villanelle though that you wrote.
Thank you. I forgot it was here. Becca, did you say there was another question or?
Yeah, Eileen asked if if there is time, and there is a little bit of time, I think we've got 15 more minutes. If there is time, can you talk about Marie Howe's influence in your poetry? Because I feel I see a hint of it in all of your books.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say this, when I moved to Cambridge, Kathy, you were already ensconced Cantabrigian, but when it was actually, I think I don't know if Rod Kessler is still here, but he suggested I take this workshop by this woman named Marie Howe, who had like this little Scotch taped sign up at the Grolier, that we were going to, do this workshop for like $50 or something. This was like in 1990, and yeah. So I had majored in English, as an undergrad in college, and so we would meet at her house, and this was the first time, for some reason, in her writing, I was able to hear like a line of poetry outside of just an iambic pentameter line, or I was scanning a line. I could hear this syntactical music in her writing. I know I'm not explaining it well, but I think, like, it's like, your first boyfriend or girlfriend, you never forget them, and so yes, Eileen, you definitely hear her work. I remember when I was at Warren Wilson, one of my teachers, the brilliant Ellen Bryant Voigt, who, I don't know if there's anybody smarter than she is, but we would talk a lot about syntactical rhythm as opposed to metrical rhythm in a line, and I think I lean to Lean, not Eileen. I lean more towards a syntactical rhythm, because conversational rhythm, you know what I mean. That feels better for me, on a physical level, because poetry is a physical thing. It's muscular. It's all of that. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, Eileen. But
Eileen, I'm very flattered that you would hear anything of Marie Howe in my poems. She's a poet whose work I admire, but I don't feel particularly influenced by her. Maybe because we're kind of the same generation. And so the people, like the poet I studied with was Anne Sexton. And so the time when I was beginning to write, it was all imagery. And so in that sense, I think I was, more influenced by maybe even the confessional poets in a way, in terms of influence. And then I think I've been able to learn new things from reading, new poets. But I love Marie Howe's work, and I'm quite flattered that you would mention us.
I think Lisa just said a what when you just dropped that casual. Oh, yeah. I worked with Anne Sexton. That's pretty.
Well, it was sort of like working with Marie Howe now. She was teaching at BU. Yeah, and I did go there because I wanted to study with her.
Oh. That's so amazing. My teacher, Anne Sexton.
There were some students who got very, very close with her. I felt a little wary of her because I thought, let's see, there were so many women poets just at the end of their ropes. She killed herself. It was the year after I left, I think. And I thought, I don't know how involved. I was just at the same time I went to study with her, I was also trying to distance myself a little bit from some of that kind of emotion, I guess.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Well, I was going to say that we have unbelievably only about 12 minutes left, and I know that I would love it if you could close out with a poem or two, perhaps. But before we do that, are there any last questions from anyone? And then, we can let these two read, and then we can kind of close out. So that work?
Sure.
Yeah. Sounds great.
Do you want me
Do
to
you
read
want-
10?
Yeah, you start. I'm going to be looking as
All right. I'm going to read a poem that's not like, it's kind of different from the ones that we've discussed, but, you know, as Jen was saying, the last part of the book, it's sort of more, I don't know, a lot more family and personal experience. It's a poem about my father before he died. His answer. I lean forward, trying to keep up conversation as I watch my father make himself eat. At 96, he struggles to maintain his weight. 40 minutes for a tiny sandwich, a speck of salad, then cake, ice cream, whipped cream, chocolate sauce. I can't taste anything, he tells me, only desserts. The sweet taste buds are the last to go. He still shaped my father, the marine engineer. Every morning he showers, shaves, dresses himself. I used to be handy, he says. I went around and fixed things for everyone. Now it takes 2 people to help me in and out of the car. I don't want to be bedridden. And what can I say, the mouthy child, who started this by asking what he looks forward to each day? Nothing, he shrugs. I've outlived myself. You were talking about mouth. I was considered the mouthy one in my family.
So I'll read. This is in homage, Kathy. This is a self-portrait poem. Self-portrait as the half-dead cherry tree outside the bedroom window. I've retaken my daughter's room, gone back to the time before children when I wore an 18-karat rope chain around my neck to my breastbone and dangled a gold-plated razor blade, an Italian horn, a miraculous medal for lost causes, a vial. What happened is this: I wanted the impossible, for you, ignorant of my indifference, to love me. Do you understand this as greed? As a child, my dolls were hybrids, part dog, part cowgirl, a small devil. I found my father's baby doll at my grandma's in her back bedroom off the kitchen with the Bafana witch, the doll's porcelain skull shattered over its fontanelle. Grandma said not to tell anyone ever about this thing I'd found. How do we survive sadness? Like a dream? Is my sadness only interesting to me? Last year, the cherry tree blossomed for the first time in a long while. It had been split and split again by bolts of lightning that cracked the road as well. Thanks. Thank you. Thank you, Kathy.
Thank you, Jen. And thank you, Becca and Lisa, for having us. And thanks all of you for coming. And particularly thank you, Jennifer Martelli, for your wonderful book and poems.
Oh, thank you, Kathy and Lisa and Becca and everybody. This was a lot of fun. It was great to sort of go back to your book, Kathy. It's a masterpiece.
Again, for the millionth time. Yeah.
I can't thank you two enough for being here. I'm still collecting myself, so sorry. I want to invite everybody to unmute and give Kathy and Jennifer a round of applause for their reading and their conversation, which I think was really amazing. We would love for you to buy Kathy and Jen's books. We dropped the links in several times. We would also love for you to keep up with their work via social media. We have dropped those links into the chat as well. You can also find them probably on our website and on our social media pages. And finally, a shameless plug for Becca and I, we would like for you to stay connected with us as well. The best way to do that is through the newsletter. We promise that we don't spam you. We just send you important information about events and things that are coming up. Speaking of which, we have some great things planned into the new year. So we hope that you come back for those conversations as well. And we're going to say good night.
Yes, thank you so much for coming. And yes,
Thank you.
have a wonderful evening.
Yeah.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Without a cat.
Put this to